Welcome to Lecture 7. This is the summing up. This is part 2 and getting close to the end of the course. This is the last bit of the lectures. Right, let me take you back to Descartes. Remember, Descartes sought certainty, and he sought it by trying to find a way to refute the skeptical doubts that he was plagued with. He used skepticism as a way of testing his beliefs in his quest to find certain foundations for the big edifice of knowledge of science that he was going to construct. And he discovered the cogito, the thought, I think, therefore I am, and he tried to build all knowledge on such certainties. And in his picture of the world, we only come to know the world indirectly. Directly, we're only aware of the contents of our own minds, that is, our ideas. So there was a gap between the ideas that are in our mind and what the world is like out there. We've got to somehow bridge that gap, and that gap is the gap that skeptics used in Descartes to undermine the idea that our ideas were accurately representing the world. Well, Irish empiricist Berkeley argued that Descartes' way of disarming the skeptic was doomed to failure, and suggested the only way you could refute the skeptic was to argue that the world itself, things like my whiteboard marker, are actually made of ideas, and that we, spirits, perceive these ideas. So in that way, there's no contrast between what we know directly, ideas, and the world, because the world is literally made of ideas. Well, if Berkeley were right, then we could come to know the world directly, and there'd be no gap for that skeptical doubt to arise in. We saw something about Berkeley last time, and it didn't go well. In fact, it was the Scottish philosopher David Hume who actually demolished this approach. And he argued that this and every other approach to refute skepticism was bound to fail. And for Hume, the lesson was that we had to find a way of living with, or perhaps despite, those skeptical doubts that we're plagued with. And Hume's skeptical response to skepticism involved recognizing a crucial fact about us, he said, and this seems to me to be correct. He said, believing is not voluntary. You don't choose to believe. So in effect, those skeptical doubts about many things don't really get a grip on us. Hume said it's only in matters of high theory that we can actually talk seriously about voluntarily withholding assent. Ordinarily, if I'm now trying to stop believing that this is a whiteboard marker, I can pretend, but I find it really hard not to believe that this is a whiteboard marker. And as he put it, nature had not left this to the skeptic's choice, and had doubtless esteemed it an affair of too great importance to be trusted to our uncertain reasonings and speculations. So, in other words, luckily for us, we find ourselves believing enough to survive in the world despite our uncertainties. But the skeptics, according to Hume, show us something really, really important about our condition in the world. That seeking of certainty, the standard that Descartes made the standard for accepting any rational belief, that you had to be certain before you'd accept it, Hume argues that this shows that this is an impossible ideal. Our knowledge can't attain that sort of certainty for very many beliefs, even beliefs that we ordinarily and are on reflection accept as knowledge. From that, if Hume were right, it follows that knowledge is possible without certainty. And I think Hume is right there, that knowledge is possible without certainty. But not only that, I want to make another important claim here. And not only is it possible to have knowledge without certainty, which is our ordinary situation, but also this, that vulnerability to skepticism and the objectivity of our thoughts, the fact that our thoughts are about an objective world, are actually two sides of the very same coin. So insofar as our beliefs are about an objective world, and I think most of them are, just so far should we expect to find that gap that Berkeley tried to close up to keep the skeptics' doubts out, so that our vulnerability to skepticism that Hume emphasized is no more and no less than the fact that we are trying to know a world that is not a product of our own minds. It's an objective world. So that world that we're trying to know is complex and as hard to know as anything can be, but it's also knowable. Famous Hungarian philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, once said that anyone who thinks that we've not made progress in understanding the world is simply ignorant. Right? We know an awful lot more now than we used to know. And you and I have got some mighty shoulders to stand on, and we've come to know more and more about the world. And when we say all that, it's important not to think that we're saying that we're smarter than people in the past. Right? I think it's absolutely plausible to say that no one has made more important discoveries and intellectual innovations than Aristotle. He really has shaped the way we think about so many different things. And Aristotle is absolutely a big beacon for me as an intellectual light to guide myself by. But in fact, asking whether Aristotle was smarter than Kant or Descartes or Einstein or Gödel, by the way, that's Gödel standing there with Einstein, Gödel that we talked about in the lecture on truth. Each of these thinkers has made something really important, has achieved something really important, and each of them has allowed real progress in our understanding. And each of them depended on previous work. They each stood on shoulders of others. So what do I want you to get out of this course? Well, hopefully you thought it was a worthwhile way to spend just short of 2 weeks. And probably most of you decided to do it for the 6 units of credit. And I fully expect that you'll all get it. But I don't really care whether you're sitting in here just because you're interested. It would be fantastic to me if you were just sitting in because you're interested. Because once upon a time, universities encouraged that sort of genuinely in curiosity-based inquiry. And would that they still could. It would be a fantastic thing. So let me tell you what I believe. I believe we're able to use our reason, our intellect, to engage with the world. And I believe that Descartes' situation, remember when he was describing his situation of the conflicting views that he didn't know what to believe, I think that's a perennial situation. I think that's us. I think that we can all confronted with differing, conflicting views that we find it hard to choose between, or sometimes do. And we also, if we reflect on our history and on our beliefs, we find ourselves saddled with many beliefs that perhaps we've adopted uncritically. Who knows where some of my beliefs have come from. So the Enlightenment Kant, when he wrote in his essay, What is Enlightenment? He said it was the maturation of humanity. Humanity coming to think for itself. So you need to learn to think for yourself. And we all try and do this. And every discipline in the university says that they encourage or they teach critical thinking. But in fact, I think there's only one discipline that teaches you to think for yourself, and that is philosophy. And philosophy gets attacked for many, many things. For its being unhistorical, for its being male-centered, for its being reason-centered. And I think those criticisms are mostly mistaken, mostly but not all. But I think there is one thing I would say about philosophy. When Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living, he was probably being a little harsh, but he was making a really important point. We have the capacity to think for ourselves, to ask ourselves, what sort of life is worth living? Is it the sort of life we are actually living? Or is it perhaps a life of celebrity? Is that a life worth living? Or a political life? Or a powerful financial life? Are these the lives that are worth living? Or perhaps a life of creativity, of love, of sporting excellence? This is as important a question as we will ever face. What matters to you? And remember, this is not a question of what do you want? Because our desires are like our beliefs. Our desires have been instilled in us in all sorts of different ways as well. The real question is not what you want, but rather, on reflection, what would you want yourself to want? What sort of person do you want to be? So most people go through their lives hurrying from one concern to another, right? And the joys of their lives are as real as anything could be. And they're as real as Socrates' joys and sorrows. And the difference between them is not that Socrates is happy and they're sad. That's not what makes Socrates' life a fulfilling life, a life that's admirable. Philosophy started in the past with the idea that we could live better lives, better on reflection lives, if we reflected rationally, and that means critically, on our lives. This was, and I reckon it still is, a radical idea. So imagine, people came to think that far from following people in authority, we should question them, regardless of whether they're religious or political authorities. When philosophy first arose among the Greeks in the ancient world, it was debated whether reason or poetic inspiration was a surer route to understanding, to knowing what to do. And philosophy was actually, even then, contrasted with wisdom. Philosophers loved wisdom. They were lovers of wisdom. That's the origin of the term philosophia. And they certainly sought it, but they were not for that reason wise. They weren't for that reason sages. In fact, the ancient Greeks distinguished between sages, the sophi, as they called them, and the philosophers, the philosophies. I won't try and give you the Greek. I'm tripping myself up. It's late. And in later philosophy, which in those days, remember, still incorporated what we call science today. It was actually contrasted with theology. That image, by the way, is the image of an oracle looking into the cloudy water to see the future. So again, there was this contrast, just as there was earlier with the Greeks, and they were talking about the medieval. There's a contrast between the natural light of reason, how much can we know by reason and our experience, and how much depends on a divine light of inspiration, the analogous to the poetic inspiration. Today, some people contrast philosophy and philosophical approaches to other things, to science, for example, or common sense on the other. It's often said that philosophy contrasts with both science and common sense. But in a way, I'd say this is nothing like as radical as the earlier contrasts, because between science and philosophy, and between philosophy and common sense, there really isn't a distinctive way of coming to understand. Both philosophy and science emphasize reason and argument, and both philosophy and common sense emphasize coming to understand things by thinking them through and finding out for yourself. Not that there aren't lots of elements in both that need reflecting, and in common sense, for example, we would need to ask questions like, what is intuition? How much of what we believe is due to our place in a history, a tradition of believers, and connected to that? What is the role of others in allowing us to know? How much do I know, as it were, on my own, and how much do I know because of my relationship with others, my place in a society? How much comes from testimony and trust in others, for example? But notice those sorts of questions, which are really interesting questions, there's nothing in them that's as radical as the contrast between the natural light of reason of looking and exploring for yourself and thinking things through, and the idea of a divinely inspired, revealed truth that only the elect can get access to, or between the idea of experience and poetic ecstasy. So, not too long ago, there was this other notion that has, I think, and I'm hoping, has lost its luster. That is the idea of authority. Maybe as part of what's going on, the notion of an authority that just has to be listened to uncritically is coming up. I hope not. But in any case, once upon a time, what was said by someone in authority carried, or what was in the book, carried more weight than most of us can imagine. When medievals wrote, indeed, what they tried to do when they figured out a view was to find a way of finding that view in the writings of their predecessors. And you might say that the vestige that we have of this in our practice of knowledge is actually not in knowledge, but in the legal emphasis in precedent. That may be one of the last vestiges of that. The idea of authority is really not one that's ever sat well with philosophy. Philosophy is largely about killing your predecessors, of arguing with them, and we engage with our predecessors largely by critically reacting to them. So this is not new. In Diogenes Laertius, we have this story of one of Pyrrho's students. You remember Pyrrho was the Greek philosopher who went with Alexander's army to India and brought back skeptical doctrines from India. And he himself had students, and one of his students was walking with his students, and those students were asking him questions that he couldn't answer, and so he stripped off and swam across a river to get away from them. Right? The students that were hassling him were displaying the sort of attitude we expect from philosophy students. Remember, this is written about, the story we have in Diogenes is written, this probably would have been about 250 to 270 BC. So this is the way philosophy students go. They challenge you. They ask you difficult questions. This is what we want from philosophy students. Criticism and debates are actually cornerstones of philosophy. And in fact, if you think about it, they're cornerstones of inquiry in general. When you're interested in a debate, you'll inevitably turn your attention to try and understand whether something is a good argument and when something is not a good argument, right? Because you're now interested in, well, is this move in the debate a good move, right? That seems to be, and that's certainly what Aristotle says, the origin of logic as an area for study. It was actually studied because it made clear when these debates were dealing with good arguments and when they weren't. So philosophy sits ill with authority. Authority sits ill with philosophy, but philosophy was under the yoke of theology in the West after what used to be called the Dark Ages. And even in the Eastern Mediterranean, which actually never went through a Dark Age, literary traditions were unbroken in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it was the Renaissance which led into the Enlightenment, which once again started to question the very idea of authority, which gave rise to the idea that we could think for ourselves. So the Enlightenment of the 18th century was the most prominent recent attempt to organize society and lives within it, as they put it, in accordance to reason. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, like Locke and Diderot questioned and criticized the assumed authority and privilege of those in power. And you get quotes like this from Voltaire. Those who make you believe absurdity can make you commit atrocities. That seems to be relevant today, doesn't it? And it's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. Voltaire's really a thinker of light. And this is John Stuart Mill, with the Enlightenment came a certain reaction to it. And it's a reaction, I think, that a movement of mind with which Enlightenment tendencies of mind still are in tension. And that is the idea of Romanticism. John Stuart Mill emphasized in the middle of the 19th century that if the 18th century glorified light and reason, so the 19th century, the century in which Romanticism came to really predominate, the 19th century glorified the irrational sentiments, the passions and the emotions. So the Enlightenment tended to be universalist. It emphasized the idea that we all shared reason, that we could all use it to order our lives, and that no race and no sex was excluded from it. The Romantics, on the other hand, emphasized the differences amongst us. And there were lots of differences. There was sex, there was class, there was religion, there was race. And it's no accident that the Nazi ideology grew out of the Romantic criticisms of the Enlightenment. There's a big debate about whether Nazis were just a logical consequence of Romanticism, where they'd misunderstood the true deep ideas in Romanticism, but no one doubts that they were deeply influenced by that idea of a special, separate histories for races and sexes and groups of people. So today, if we think about this contrast between Enlightenment universalist thinking on the one side and the Romantic irrationalist thinking on the other, well, the last vestiges of that probably is postmodernism. And it seems to be dying a well-deserved death, but it's just the latest version of the glorification of the irrational. So perhaps the rise of fundamentalism and postmodernism together, historically speaking, is no accident, because both of them see themselves as having uncovered something to which mere rational argument and empirical evidence is either going to be irrelevant because of the depth of their insights, or insufficient because it starts with the wrong premises or something. But I think both of them think that the emphasis on evidence and reason is limited. And on the one hand, the insensitivity to reason and the evidence that we might call blind faith might be a cause of belief, right? If you are insensitive to reason and evidence and you form beliefs, that through, say, blind faith, that can be a cause of a belief, but it's not a reason to believe. Reasons to believe have to be the sort of thing that can be understood and motivate others. But on the other hand, treating the Enlightenment and its emphasis on evidence and reason as just one among many of the fetishes of the tribe, to use Hobbes's phrase, seriously limits the way we think of ourselves. Okay, so Stephen Colbert had this show called the Colbert Report, in which he coined the term truthiness, and he defined it as it's to describe things that a person claims to know intuitively or from the gut, without regard to evidence, logic, intellectual examination, or actual facts. And people are talking today about us living in a post-truth world. And you might think this is a new concept, but no. When Martin Heidegger, well-known Nazi philosopher, was telling one of his colleagues that Hitler should be the one to appoint all the philosophy professors, his colleague said to him, "But Hitler doesn't know anything about philosophy." And to which Heidegger replied, "No, but have you seen his hands?" So this idea that there's something special about Hitler, that Hitler just knew who the good philosophers were, who the right philosophers were. And it turned out recently that this emphasis on Hitler's hands was not a unique fetish in Heidegger. This image here is an image that was widely disseminated amongst Hitler's adoring fans. And it may well be that there was this image that Heidegger was alluding to. Somehow this image of the hands might well have made Heidegger think that, yeah, this is the guy to choose all the philosophy professors. Well, now, as we say that, you've got to remember that it's only just last week that is the 76th anniversary of the liberation by the Russians of the Nazi death camp, Auschwitz. And you may also know that Heidegger, when he was rector, there he is with his Nazi pin, when he was addressing the student body of the University of Freiburg, where he was rector, he said to them, "Doctrine and ideas shall no longer govern your existence. The Führer himself, and only he, is the current and future reality of Germany, and his word is your law." Right? So just listen to the boss. Don't think about things. Right? Don't be critical. Just follow the leader. Just outrageous claim. And this idea that mere ideas and truth and seeking truth is to be replaced by a strong leader is actually curiously coming up in the world many places today. I mean, as we've seen, from America to Brazil to Russia and other places. And this is the idea that perhaps we've moved beyond a time when truth was important to a new and different situation. It seems a seductive idea, but it's one that I think is really mistaken and dangerous for our society. So this is the idea of post-truth, right? So you will have heard people say things like, well, what's the problem? You know, who's to say what's true? Isn't everybody entitled to their opinion? And doesn't the fact that there's no certainty, which we said earlier in this lecture, right? I said that we're going to have to live in a world without certainty. Well, doesn't it mean that no one can be objective? And if you're not certain, if you believe anything, you're going to be biased. So what's wrong with being biased? Okay. This is the type of position that seems to me to be very, very wrong. It misses a lot of crucial distinctions. It misses the distinction between certainty and objectivity. Remember, I wanted to say that our beliefs about the world are objective. They can be objectively wrong or objectively wrong. Right or wrong. And the fact that we're not certain is that we're not certain whether they are objectively right and objectively wrong. So objectivity, making ourselves vulnerable to the evidence, we do that because we're trying desperately to get at objective truth. We're not acquiescing in our own first blush, what we'd like to be true. On the other hand, there is an important difference between knowledge and opinion and bias on the other. I am opinionated, and I have views that I've been arguing for in this course. Does that mean that I'm biased? Well, no, because being biased is about not looking at the evidence, right? Choosing to ignore some of the evidence. Even if I look at all the evidence and I have an opinion, I'm still not going to be certain because I might be wrong, right? That means I have an opinion and I hope that it's knowledge. If it's right and I've looked at all the evidence and it's well founded, I'm hoping that what I believe is knowledge, even though I'm not certain about it. It's a criticism of me to say that I'm biased, that I refuse to look at the evidence that some view of mine is wrong. That would be a criticism, and I hope that it's a criticism that is misplaced, that I actually do look at the evidence. And for us in our liberal democracy, this idea of conflation of all these important notions and the undermining of reason that's part of it, and so deeply part of fundamentalism and postmodernism and the widespread deployment of propaganda, it actually presents us in a liberal democracy in particular with some real problems. Democracy is based on a few really important precepts, and one of them is that the force of reason is preferable to the force of violence. And if we are going to make people sensitive to reason, if we're going to make people adopt cognitive strategies that makes them look at evidence, if that's what we are wanting for our liberal democracy to survive, then we need a vibrant education system that actually educates people to think for themselves, that doesn't just tell them what to think and doesn't think of itself as preparing them for the workplace. We've seen reasons for thinking that we're living in an objective world, and insofar as we're living in an objective world, we're faced with a lack of certainty about our beliefs, something I mentioned earlier. But lacking certainty is not the same thing as being open-minded on a matter. I'm not certain about a lot of my beliefs. I'm not certain, for example, that Ian Jacobs is now, right now, as you're listening to this, the Vice-Chancellor of UNSW. We all saw his email where he said that he's leaving in a year. Well, maybe there's evidence that I haven't seen that makes me doubt my conviction that he is right now the Vice-Chancellor of UNSW. Perhaps the staff have revolted. Perhaps he thinks, no, my work here is done, I can go. So even now, without that undermining evidence and knowing that there could be such evidence, I'm not absolutely certain that he is the Vice-Chancellor. But lacking certainty is not the same thing as lacking beliefs. I can have beliefs which I am confident about, even to the extent of betting on them without being certain on them. So what is this betting? betting on my beliefs is not just the act of wagering money on outcomes. Much, much more importantly, it's about acting in the world. When I bet on my beliefs whenever I act in the world. These beliefs are, as Hume puts it, the grounds of all my action. And you bet that the world is a certain way whenever you sit on a chair, whenever you bite into an apple, whenever you cuddle a kitten, whenever you jump out of the way of a speeding bus. So knowledge and certainty are two quite separate notions. And when people ask me what sort of philosophy I do, I tend to answer that I do kind of trivial philosophy. I start with my own beliefs and I try and think them through. And I don't know that I really would adopt any real ism. I'm not an ism kind of guy. But I try to be honest about my beliefs. I try to think them through, and I try and open my mind to objections and weigh things up and try and look into things and think through those puzzles, the aporeias that I mentioned, that Aristotle said we find ourselves being struck by. Well, when I do that, I think that even though it's kind of trivial in one way, I think that attempt to think things through, to think for myself, to figure out what I really think if I put my mind to it, I think that's really serious. And of course it's fun. I love doing it. I love teaching it. And I hope you've enjoyed this little bit of philosophy that you've done. But I think crucial to philosophy is that you're able to think through your own understanding of the world. And that means that if you believe that there are buses, you better come up with a philosophy, or at least find yourself attracted to a philosophy that allows for there being buses. If your philosophy is to allow for your honest convictions, or when you do philosophy, you're just bullshitting. You're not doing it seriously. You're not actually seriously engaging with your own honest convictions. So whether you go on in philosophy or not, realize this. As we try to figure things out in this world, what we value, we are all doing philosophy. So in that way, because we all do try and figure out what things are in the world, we all do try and figure out what we should believe. We all do try and figure out what we value. So in that way, we're all doing philosophy. But and that fits with the idea that, well, look, any question pushed far enough becomes a philosophical question, as Bert Drebin once said. He was a Harvard philosopher. And the only alternative to thinking well is thinking badly. And I hope you know now where to go to learn to think well. Good luck, and I hope you've enjoyed this brief course. I know that I have. I'll see you, hopefully, in the flesh when this terrible period passes. Goodbye and good luck.